This is not a secret, and it's not new. I just haven't had the energy to make frequent videos in the last bunch of years since I got a job, so it hasn't come up on the channel. Not directly, anyway. So I guess I owe it to myself to finally say it out loud, on camera, in front of probably threes of people. At least one of which is probably going to say, this is all just a bunch of nonsense, to which I say, don't you think I've considered that? Don't you think I've examined that possibility before rejecting it? Hi, I am a person. In a comedy video years ago, I mentioned having come out of the wrong closet in my early teens because people told me I was gay. Complicated story. When I was talking about that, I was still kind of openly closeted. I didn't quite have the words to describe what I am, and I didn't know myself very well. I just knew I didn't feel comfortable with the boxes other people had tried to put me in. Ever. And I kept thinking about it, and I sort of gradually found the words, and I've been out. But unless you're famous, being out is like walking around with a closet door until the subject comes up and then going peekaboo. But before I got to that point, I kept replaying a few moments in my life where I feel like I got really close to understanding what I am. I'm gonna have to go back to the beginning, aren't I? Or as close to it as I can get. I mean, I remember being in daycare and distinctly having the thought that I can't remember being less than 3 years old, so I guess that's the hard stop. I had weird thoughts as a kid. Another one of those thoughts was, what's with this whole girls and boys thing? It feels like a divide that the grown-ups are pushing really hard for that seems entirely arbitrary. That probably sounds like a thought a child wouldn't have, but I did. Not in those words, but I'm translating. I thought it was weird to label an entire person based on something so inconsequential, and sort people into these categories and raise them differently. I remember feeling like I was expected to relate more to one of these groups than the other, which I didn't. And I couldn't see the supposed connection between what your private anatomy looks like and who you are as a person, which seemed to be the narrative that was being pushed. It seemed forced, but I was a small child, and maybe I'll understand when I get older, right? Yeah, spoiler alert, that doesn't happen. Well, okay, a little bit. I understand that it is partially forced, and that there is some instinct of mimicking behavior that generally tends to follow certain gender patterns, and that what the grown-ups are doing is enforcing that general pattern as a rule and exaggerating it with stereotypes. This is where it gets particularly complicated for gender non-conforming children, whether it's having an aversion to that over-encouraged mimicry or an apparent inversion of it. I had no context for any of this, and nobody to validate my need to distance myself from gender, so all I could think was either gender is stupid or I'm gender stupid. And I went on to bounce between those two mindsets for years and years. Some of the time cynically opposing the entire concept, and some of the time trying really hard to force myself to embrace it. Anyone familiar with Hegelian dialectic should know where this is going. We have a thesis, gender is stupid, an antithesis, I'm gender stupid. We'll get back to that. In the 90s, trans representation in the media was awful. Very misleading. See, like a lot of people, the narrative I had been fed about transsexuals as a kid in the 90s is that they were people who decided that they wanted to be the other gender, and so they have had surgery. That's it. Now, I wasn't opposed to that. Whatever you want to do, that's your business. But that's not what it is, that's not how it works, and it doesn't clear anything up. In fact, every part of that sentence is wrong except for their people. The first time I really started learning about what transgender actually means was I was maybe around age 18, so this would have been a few years after I stopped telling people I was gay, and while I was openly uncertain, vaguely asexual-ish, and generally feeling like I wasn't quite any of the labels that had been presented to me. In other words, I was still bouncing between thesis and antithesis. But two things happened. One is online social networking, and the other is a friend of mine showing me the movie Boys Don't Cry. That's not a recommendation. It's a very sad story and not a good introduction to the subject, but it did play a small but important part. See, around the same time, on a social networking platform you haven't heard of that nobody uses anymore, I came briefly in contact with a transgender person who explained the very basics of gender identity and how it's separate from anatomical sex characteristics, and that transition isn't all about the surgery, all of which made more sense than the concept of gender I was previously familiar with. So I guess that thought that had been nagging me since daycare started looking like a dot waiting to be connected. And I had to ask, is there such a thing as being neither a man nor a woman in terms of identity? And I was told, in brief, yes, that is also transgender. Oh. That was the first time in my life that I had the thought, am I transgender? It was also the first time I heard that term, so there was still a significant gap in my knowledge, but I felt like I was getting closer to a synthesis. That brings me back to the friend who showed me Boys Don't Cry. I don't know which happened first, it's a bit of a blur, but I did know that this friend wasn't transphobic, or at least was non-transphobic enough to empathize with Brandon Tina, which was enough to embolden me to say out loud to her and another friend that I don't think I have a gender identity. I don't feel like a man, but I also don't feel like a woman. I've never felt that I belonged in either of the groups, boys or girls, and when you're in school, or at least when I was, you get shoved into one of those groups a lot. So there's a lot of time to notice something's off, even if you're not sure what. Like, if you get forcefully grouped in with a bunch of boys, and they're all connecting on some boy wavelength, and you're the one person feeling like you shouldn't be there because you're a space alien, you tend to notice. Now, around the time I had that revelation, this same friend asked me, because this friend's mother had wondered after meeting me, if I had what was then called Asperger's syndrome. Another thing I wasn't familiar with. So I looked it up, read up on it, learned about it. Seemed very plausible. Found online community, saw a counselor. After a few talks that seemed to point to a very likely yes, they told me they'd put me on a waiting list for evaluation. And then after nothing happening for what seemed like an eternity, I found out there had been a miscommunication and I wasn't on the list. So it took long enough for the name of the diagnosis to change before I actually got it. But yeah, I have autism spectrum disorder. And that whole thing kind of distracted me from thinking about gender for a bit. Genderstupid? Pfft, I'm just autistic. That's what it is. That's why I feel out of place. Right? Right? Cut to online social networking and the autism community. Did you know there's a fair amount of trans people on the autism spectrum? 'Cause I found that out, and public conversation about transgender identities was just starting to really happen. Actual transgender people were starting to be heard rather than just heard about. I started hearing things like bigender, third gender, gender fluid, the non-binary umbrella, and eventually agender. The absence of an internal sense of gender, which is me, definitely me, 100% always been me, even when I was trying to deny it, not think about it, describe myself against my own discomfort, as if I weren't. That's been me the whole time. I'm not just on the autism spectrum, I'm also off the gender spectrum. I don't have to deny the validity of gender as a concept, and I don't have to pretend to be a part of it. I simply exist separate from it, and I can aim to understand it from an outside perspective. Synthesis. I'm gonna rewind again because I haven't said the word dysphoria. A lot of people think of gender dysphoria as a strictly binary thing. You're uncomfortable with B, you'd rather A. There's not as much talk about non-binary dysphoria. I'm sure it's different between different types of non-binariness, and it might vary from person to person, or from day to day if you're gender fluid. Being agender, I experience some degree of dysphoria in a few different contexts, falling generally under uncomfortable with A, and would rather not. A lot of it is social, but also some physical things. For example, facial hair. Here's the thing. I'm not someone who cares much about appearances, but the sensation of hair coming out of my face just feels wrong. When it grows out, my instinct is to pull it out. The longer I resist, the stronger the urge. I used to have this hemostat. It's one of those surgical clamps. It must have been out of a first aid kit or something. When my facial hairs were first starting to come in, I would use it to pinch onto a chunk of facial hair, if it had grown long enough, squeeze the follicles with my fingers, and slowly pull the hairs out, because it felt physically wrong to have hairs growing out of my face. I don't recommend doing this. I wouldn't have recommended it back then, but I did it anyway, compulsively and because I could. Eventually, the hemostat broke, and I haven't bought a new one because it's not a good habit. But the urge never went away. I still hate the hair. Every once in a while, I forget to shave or just don't because it's irritating. It gets to that length where I pull them without even thinking. With my nails, one at a time, and I look at them, and they look like spider legs. Why are there spider legs growing out of my face? Stop it! Can I just not grow hair out of my face, please? That'd be good. That's just one example. Speaking of hair, I'm gonna rewind again. It's my video. This doesn't have to be linear. For a while, as a kid, I had long hair. Hair is not gender. I'm just mentioning it for context. I grew it out a couple times, not for any reason I could have told you, but one time I was at a comic book store, probably looking for the John Arcudi, Doug Mankey original run of The Mask, which they didn't have, and which is not for kids, and I needed to use the bathroom. So I asked the clerk if I could please do that. The clerk said, yes, but we only have a boys' bathroom if that's okay. Now, in retrospect, that was a weird thing to say because it was a regular toilet. I think he was just trying to make me feel out of place because he thought I was a girl, because of the hair and prepubescent voice, and he probably was just being low-key misogynist. But I didn't think of that at the time. The only thing I could think was, wow, someone didn't think I was a boy. Neat. Not because I wanted to be seen as a girl, but because for one brief moment, I was not perceived as a boy. It was an unexpected break from social gender dysphoria, you know? And I haven't forgotten that. So I said, yeah, that's fine. The clerk may have thought of that as a boys' bathroom, but on that day it wasn't. You know, non-gendered bathrooms, not that difficult. All you need is a toilet and a real door. And a sink. Wash your damn hands. Sometimes I think gendered bathrooms are a scam to sell disgustingly inferior inventions such as urinals and doors with perv gaps. There's also the pronoun thing. That's a tricky one. Throughout my childhood, I always felt rude referring to other people by pronouns that implied their gender. I didn't know why, because nobody ever told me they had a problem with it, or that anyone did, but it felt awkward to refer to people's gender behind their backs. In retrospect, because it felt awkward for me to be gendered, and I felt like there should be a non-gendered, all-purpose personal pronoun, and I said as much. And people were like, what? I should mention, for those who don't know, that I'm Swedish. They, as a singular pronoun, has been a thing in the English language for a very long time, maybe longer than the singular you. Look it up. In Swedish, that wasn't so much a thing. Well, there was denne, sort of, but it's kind of obscure and close to inanimate. And now there's a new one, hen, which I didn't get to vote on, but whatever, better than nothing, I guess, even though English. As a kid, I didn't know of either of these, so I just felt weird about pronouns, but I had to force myself into the habit, because supposedly I was the one who was gender stupid. I had to just get used to gendering people and try not to think of it as rude. I grew up in the wrong decade. Now, I just say my pronouns are all of them, because I spent my entire childhood being called far worse things than the wrong pronouns, so I've decided to make it harder for people to misgender me by refusing to pick a favorite. It's still awkward, and I'm sort of lying to myself, but none of the gender, all of the pronouns, it'll do for me. That's not me endorsing calling anyone else by all of the pronouns, by the way. If someone tells you their pronoun is they, or he, or she, or whatever it is, try your best to respect that, okay? Don't be a douche. You might mess up here and there, and it's not a big deal, but trying is better than doubling down, and you get used to it. I'm still working on deprogramming. I mess up on occasion, and I correct myself and move on. If you can call R2-D2 he, there's no argument to be made for the claim that pronouns require specific chromosomes or anatomical features, because astromech droids don't have any of those, and if you call Darth Vader, don't dead name trans people. There. Star Wars just destroyed Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson with facts and logic before we even got to Tatooine. I know what I look like. I know what I sound like. I'm not fluent in the language of presentation. How do you even present as the absence of gender? There's no cultural template for that. And gender is not about presentation. A lot of transphobes like to say, you can't just dress up and that makes you a different gender, and that's a straw person argument because that's not how it works. It's the other way around. People present certain ways in order to communicate their gender, not in order to change it. But I don't even do that. You'll just have to take my word for it. I present as top 10 things I present as. Number 10, almost comfortable. Number 9, person with no fashion sense. Number 8, facsimile of a human. Number 7, stole your boyfriend's hoodie and I didn't even sleep with him. Number 6, my mom bought me this. Number 5, Gender non-conforming non-conforming?
Number 4.
I woke up like this.
Number 3.
At least I shaved this time.
Number 2.
I forgot there was a presentation and I didn't do the assignment.
And number 1.
Not leaving the house today. So yeah, this is me coming out as an agender non-binary trans person, if you didn't already know that. I'm also gray asexual or demisexual or something, I guess, and theoretically polyamorous because prescriptive monogamy is too kinky for me. But that's a whole other can of nothing. Anyway, sorry this wasn't a song or a comedy thing. Here's a puppet I just made out of a hat. Hit me up in the comments if you're nice. If you want to be a douche, I'll just save you the time and say congrats, you're a douche. Nobody's forcing you to be. You could just not. To the rest of you, have a tasteful tuna.